Henry, you got within 10 seconds of glory land yesterday.
I did what?
10 seconds of glory land.
Did I?
Texas lost.
It was so close. And that should have been a safety. His lower leg was down. The refs blew that call on 3 different directions. His forward progress was stopped. Should have been a safety. His leg ended up touching the ground. Should have been a safety. He lost. Texas lost to Alabama in the final drive of the game. A game they shouldn't have been in the first place, but there they were somehow. But it's okay because A&M lost to Appalachian State, so I can still be happy. How many of y'all in this room actually care about college football in any way, form, or fashion? Like have a team that you keep up with? All right. Do what?
The Cougars won.
Okay, there you go. Because I know the next question is at Washington State or UW. Okay.
If it's the Razorbacks, we think you
Really, a Razorbacks fan?
That's where my dad graduated.
I've got a friend who was at the game yesterday.
Seahawks.
Yeah, now that's the second question because the NFL season kicks off today, so we've got a Seahawks fan in the back. How many of y'all are actually follow an NFL team? Broncos, Seahawks. Oh, I'm so sorry. I have 2 numbers in my head. Do you know what they are? Yes, 28 and 3.
I broke a TV that day.
Oh man, that was such a rough Super Bowl. It was so much fun to watch if you weren't a Falcons fan. The only thing worse, I think, would be a Bills fan and watch them get so close 4 years in a row and not pull it off. There's got to be something very disheartening about that. I guess technically I'm a Cowboys fan. It's one of those things you're born into.
Oh, yeah.
But
I've already been eliminated.
We just live in mediocrity. 8-8, 9-7 either direction, with an owner who thinks he knows sports and keeps trying to play general manager and keeps messing it up along the way.
You could send a sympathy card to my son. He's a Raiders fan.
Oh yeah, no, I have nothing on the Davis-owned tribe. Well, good morning. Glad that you are here with us. Hope you had a good weekend. Tim Ray made me sore. It's entirely his fault.
He made you do it, really?
You invited
I did. It was my idea. It was such a bad idea.
The wife always tells that.
Yeah, I was trying to get that in before you got here. You couldn't be a little slower today? No, I am aware that the NFL season kicks off now in like an hour. So for those of you who are following the scores on your phones during service, like just give me some hand signals to let me know. For Sundays when the Seahawks are playing during church,
They played Monday night.
don't try to hide it. Just let me know so I can lean into it and understand that you're watching the game.
Don't worry, it's church old.
They're suddenly cheering in church. What do we do with this? Yes, this week we get the off. Yeah, no, I got you. All right, well, we are continuing on after a week off looking at how to read the Bible. And as I told you a couple weeks ago when we were looking at Gospels generally, we would circle back around and talk about parables more specifically. Of course, parables do not exist only in the New Testament, do they? There are a number of parables in the Old Testament. And then the other part of that is parables in general, wisdom stories, are not limited to the Bible, not limited to the Jewish tradition, are they? Stories that contain wisdom and are designed to instruct and to teach are something that exists culturally.
Aesop's fable.
Yeah, that's at the top of the list, ones that I grew up with in elementary school, those stories that just became a part. And if you look back at ancient cultures that exist at the same time as the Old Testament being written, whether that's Babylonian, Assyrian, Greek, they all contain their own wisdom stories. So when we look at parables in the Bible, and Jewish parables specifically, we have to look at how these stories were used by them. It's just because cultures have them doesn't mean they're all used for the exact same purposes and the exact same reasons. The other thing I would point out is that we have often treated wisdom stories in general, thinking Aesop's fables, and parables in the Bible specifically, more as children's stories. They get taught in Bible class because they go up nice on flannel graph, and you can do coloring sheets based off those stories, and we like their characters. But churches have spent less time with the parables once you get out of elementary school. They make a sermon illustration, and then you get to the real point or whatever. But Jesus didn't use parables that way. The parables were the point. And then it's open to, do you understand? The question often being no. Although I would argue more often the answer is yes, and they just don't want to. Because if you read a parable, and what you get is a nice ending that is obvious and makes you feel good about something, you've read it wrong. The parables are not meant to be nice stories with obvious points. Jesus doesn't tell them so that you can leave feeling good about things. And they don't contain just one meaning. The point of view of the hearer affects how you hear the story. So if you're listening to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, you hear that differently if you're somebody in Jesus' audience who has been begging for scraps outside of somebody's gate, and if you're a person in Jesus' audience who is very wealthy, don't you? That story hits completely differently depending on where you are. One of the things I really like about Jewish teaching tradition is that it embraces a multitude of understandings. That's much harder for us culturally. We like things that have one meaning. This is what it means. But it was commonly understood. Rob's laughing. Are you
Black or white?
We don't do nuance well. We talked about this a few weeks ago, and we don't do multitudes well. But if you read like rabbinic writers from roughly the same time as Jesus, they talk about the Old Testament, the Torah, and the Talmud, as having 70 facets of meaning, which means each story, each passage has 70 different ways you can look at it. They didn't mean that literally. They didn't like have a list of every passage and then try and figure out what each of those meanings are. What they were trying to encourage their students to do is look at it from every imaginable angle and get as much out of the story as possible. The other thing that's happened, because our biblical understanding has been passed down through us through a multitude of cultures, is the ones early on kind of set the tone. What St. Augustine writes in 400 starts influencing what people think about stories afterwards, right? Those meanings get passed down. And whether you realize it or not, if you sit down and read a book about the parables, or if you sit down and read a commentary on the parables, the person writing that book or reading that commentary has been shaped by those who have come before. This is true for you. How many of you have a story or a sermon or a lesson that you have heard somebody give in the past that still shapes how you view a particular passage? Anybody have one of those? Yeah. Those things get passed on. And so those are things that...
I have an example.
Okay, go ahead.
Just outside of... So this last week for class, I had to take a theories of practice quiz, and Henry was sitting there beside me while I did it. And because I work in schools, and because I work with kids, and because a lot of my training has been that way, it was funny how much I agreed with all of the questions that were cognitive behavioral theory, and how if we think we do, and we could change thinking, we can change doing. And so it's, because those are the things I've been taught, that is how it's coming out in my practice for counseling as well. So there you go.
Well, and this is why having a multitude of voices is important. If you get all of your understanding, all of your information, all of your ideas from one very thin strand, you're going to miss a lot of what else feeds into that understanding. It's why if you go into my office and start looking at books on my shelves, I've got stuff written from every imaginable angle of orthodoxy and heresy. In fact, I have a book called Heresy and Orthodoxy in it. The information is there, and I think the more of it you have, the better understanding you have. So I say that to say when we read parables, we need to make sure we're looking at all of the different angles the text gives us. And by all means, pay attention to what you remember of the story, but don't automatically assume that just because you've always heard that it means this, means that, one, that it means that, or two, that it can't also mean some other things along the way. All right. So the first thing, yes.
What chapter was it?
Well, I'm not there yet, but you can go ahead and turn to Luke 10 if you'd like.
Okay, got it.
That's going to be where we really dive in, though I'm going to give some other examples first. Before we do that, I realize I jumped the gun and got started. Let's go ahead and start with a prayer, or pause and pray, and then we will continue on. God, we thank you for today. We thank you for the blessing that it is to be able to be here as a church family, to study your word, to learn more about you and how you want us to live and be in the world that you have created. Pray that you be with us as we do our best to live out our lives the way you have called us to live. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I mentioned Old Testament parables. I'm not going to ask you to go look at each of these chapters, just kind of reminding you that these exist there. In Judges 9, you have the parable of the trees, where there's the story that's given about trees asking a tree to be their king, their leader, and it works its way down through the most majestic trees down to the briar, essentially. It was a story told to make a point. The other, really, probably the best known one out of the Old Testament comes in 2 Samuel 12. That's Nathan's parable, given to David after his incident with Bathsheba and Uriah. That one is interesting because the person on the receiving end of the parable understands it before he leaves. He makes his gut reaction, that man should die. And Nathan's like, uh-huh. And David's like, oh, crud. Which is one of those lovely moments where it lands. That's not always the case with parables. Elements of parable exist in writing. One of the things I would point out is many of the stories that we read dead literally in the Old Testament never demand that they be read literally, and they contain elements of parable. Job is like that, and Jonah is like that. I think you can read those as Jewish wisdom stories, not as literal events, and still understand them perfectly well. People have argued over whether they're literal or whether they are story, and I think the answer is sure. I don't care how you read them. The point stands in those stories, the meaning that it's trying to give. Of course, by the end of Jonah, you're talking about animals repenting, which is one of those interesting elements that lends itself to a more story understanding of it. I'm not usually concerned about camels coming to Jesus. But you can read those stories for meaning. And the other way that it's been presented is that those are narrative tellings of events. So you build out the story to make greater cultural points. That's certainly all inside the realm of possibility. What I would point out there is that parable story as a way of teaching and telling is so common and shot through Jewish tradition that we don't always catch where the parables are, where the stories are, and where the historic side of things tends to lie. Plus, it happened 3,000 years ago and was written down by people who were less concerned with keeping track of actual literal history than they were with meaning of history, which certainly changes how we read that. We'll talk more about that when we talk Old Testament here in a few weeks. Parables in the New Testament mostly contains the Gospels and to Jesus as the teller. And this is where I need your interaction. What's your favorite parable?
The woman who lost the coin.
Okay. You'll like church this morning?
That's like you don't.
That's the sermon covers it and the lost sheep this morning. Yeah.
I like the prodigal son.
Prodigal son. Okay. What else? Favorite parables?
I think it's interesting that the woman with the lost coin is followed by the prodigal son.
Yeah, they're told together for a reason.
Yeah.
They build on
The way
each
they
other.
tie it together.
Yep. That's on purpose. What else? Nobody? Good Samaritan? Seriously?
Parents in the weed.
Okay. What else? Favorite parable? Can you remember a parable? Am I asking hard questions too close to when you woke up this morning? Lindsay said yes to the second option there. The Good Samaritan is the parable that I kind of want to sit with this morning. One, because it is so well known and so loved by so many people. And it's another one I think that we have domesticated. We don't allow it to be as challenging as it was. And so I want to be sure to lean into that this morning and help pull some understanding from it. First of all, the title, The Parable of the Good Samaritan, we made that up. Like the gospel writer didn't sit down and there's no book, chapter, verses, there's no punctuation. They weren't worried about giving you titles. This is all one giant Greek run-on sentence. We're the ones who identified the Good Samaritan as the point of the story. If you start looking at other ways this story has been told, the most common one, especially early on, was the parable of the man in the ditch, where it focuses on this crisis moment and what happens and who is involved with him. I think that's actually probably a better way to look at the story. By highlighting the Good Samaritan, we miss what comes before that moment, and we skip over some of the hardship the parable gives us. We also skip over identifying ourselves as the person in the ditch. And we also skip over identifying the people in the ditch around us, because we jump straight to Good Samaritan. We like Good Samaritan. We create Good Samaritan laws. We talk about people who have been Good Samaritans. We name hospitals all of them. We love the Samaritan. The rest of the story, as challenging as it is, we tend to brush by a little bit. Yeah, Rob?
Well, the title would not have passed through a Jewish person's mouth.
No.
Good and Samaritan.
Yeah. No. And we see that with the last person in the story as well. Can't even bring himself to say. But we'll get to that here in just a second. So first of all.
But the whole thing came about with the question of who my neighbor is.
Yeah. And that's the other point. When you read parables, you have to see what they're answering or what they're responding to. Jesus tells parables in teaching moments in response to something. It's not just like, hey, story time with Jesus. These are meant to do, and parables in general are meant to move people to action. They're not meant to make a good teaching point. They're meant to make you do something. He's not just answering a question about who somebody's neighbor is. He's trying to get them to go be neighborly to all those who are around him and not just his limited circle. But again, we'll get to that here in just a second. This is Luke chapter 10. It starts in verse 30. But first I want to give you context, which actually comes just a chapter before, in 9 verse 51. You don't have to follow along. This is a story that takes place before Jesus tells this parable in Luke's gospel that gives us some context for how Jesus' own followers and how Jewish culture in general felt about Samaritans and what that relationship looked like. Verse 51 of chapter 9. As the time drew near for him to ascend to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He sent messengers ahead to a Samaritan village to prepare for his arrival. But the people of the village did not welcome Jesus because he was on his way to Jerusalem. When James and John saw this, they said to Jesus, Lord, should we call down fire from heaven and burn them up? But Jesus turned and rebuked them, so they went on to another village. Hospitality is very important culturally, New Testament and Old Testament. But at no point is Jesus suggesting that bombing Samaritans into oblivion is the appropriate response for a failure to show hospitality. But does that give you a glimpse as to how Jewish people and Jesus followers felt about Samaritans? Yeah.
And also how Samaritans felt about them. He was not welcome there at all, only because he was going to Jerusalem.
So how many of you have I've given the information several times, so I doubt you remember it at all because I'm the one who said it. I feel that way. My children certainly feel that way. Where do Samaritans come from? who are the Samaritans. Okay, the region of Samaria. But why is there this historic animosity?
You have to go back into history to find out that first the Israelites were deposed and sent elsewhere.
Yep.
Elsewhere came in and took their possessions.
So when the Babylonians destroyed the northern kingdom in 722-21, depending on which calendar you look at, they deported, by their own count, something like 30,000 Jewish people, the higher-ups, royals. And they left a bunch of common people, and then, as the Babylonians did at the time, they forcibly relocated a bunch of people from all over their empire to the northern kingdom and turned it into this conglomerate, because people are less likely to rebel if they don't have their leaders amongst them and they don't have their people with them. They'll be so busy arguing with each other that they don't have time to mount a good defense against you. This is the Babylonian method, and it worked until it didn't. The Assyrians. So that was kind of how things functioned. So the northern kingdom, the people who were left behind, maintained their gods, of which Yahweh was one, and the Baals and Canaanite gods of the land that were still in rotation, and continued worship and set up eventually a counter temple to the one on Zion on a mountain in their region, Gerizim, and made sure that everybody in the northern kingdom, now called Samaria, understood that true worship of God did not take place at the temple. It took place at their mountain. They held closely the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Torah. They did not follow any of the rest of the books there. 3 guesses as to why. That was all Southern Kingdom stuff.
However,
You don't need
they
it.
were anticipating the Messiah.
Certainly. That's classic throughout traditional Judaism, of which Samaritans fall under, keeping of the Torah especially. In fact, there were arguments between some Samaritan teachers and some Jewish teachers. Hard to separate those identities out at this point, but about how best to keep Torah. And there were some, what we would consider Pharisaic elements of Samaritan belief, in as much as there were Pharisaic elements of Jewish belief. It's fascinating reading. And so that historic animosity, because they fought with each other, they've killed with each other, they've attempted to take each other as slaves, they've set up rival places of worship, all builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, until the time of Jesus. And there are massacres that take place of Jewish pilgrims by Samaritans, and of Samaritans by Jewish raiders, all throughout Jesus' lifetime, where this is just common back and forth. Which is why many during Jesus' day who lived in the region of Galilee chose to cross over and go around to Jerusalem, a less direct and more dangerous road, because it allowed them to avoid Samaria. Not a lot of love lost there. And so, there's your background, where 2 guys who have been with Jesus from the beginning, who have heard all of his teachings, including, like the Sermon on the Mount, where you're supposed to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, respond to Samaritans by going, yeah, but not them, right? That's how deep the hatred goes. So, verse 25 of chapter 10. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replies, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" Which is one of those moments where it's like, you're supposed to know this. How about you answer your own question? Jesus is answering questions with questions, which is just fantastic. It doesn't work on my children, but I'm glad it works with adults. Hunter, what were you thinking? Never gets the response I want. The man replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him, "do this and you will live." And if the man was smart, he'd have shut up. But I joke about it being smart. This is actually pretty common discourse and debate. This is just what happens. Luke identifies something in this man as trying to justify himself. People like to get in the last word or win the argument. He's not trying to get Jesus to put his foot in his mouth. He's trying to continue the conversation. He does so from a personal standpoint. We do as well, don't we? I mean, if you've had these moments where you're having conversation with someone and it seems like the conversation's at the end, but you just kind of prod to keep it going, he does the same thing. He gets an answer he's not expecting. The man wants to justify his actions, so he asks Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" So Jesus told them this parable. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead on the side of the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man was lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed him by on the other side. All right, how many of you have heard a reason why they passed by? What's the reason you've heard?
I'm unclean.
No such law exists in the Old Testament. Yeah, he's going to cough on it. Jewish people touch dead bodies all the time. You prepare them for burial. This is commonality. They're not trying to avoid touching dead bodies. Yes, it has something to do with impurity in the temple eventually, but the dude's not dead. That's step one. Two, if you actually read the law, it is almost entirely oriented towards getting people to do good for other people. Yes, there's some stuff about sacrifice in there, but have you seen that whole year of Jubilee thing? Where you get a giant cultural reset button every 50 years so that people have a fighting chance? It was very geared towards taking care. If you accidentally kill somebody, here are 5 cities you can go and flee to and live to, no questions asked. You messed up and that's okay. We're not about vengeance and judgment on every turn. There's safety and there's forgiveness. So if you read this story and go, oh, well, I mean, they're choosing temple cleanliness over, no. That's not it.
Because he's a Samaritan.
Well, the man in the ditch isn't. The man in the ditch, traditionally Jewish man.
They were too busy.
Yeah. Let's make it this simple. They chose not to. How many of you have ever seen a good thing you needed to do and chose not to do it? Honestly, they chose not to. Dr. King had a really good. Go ahead.
Another thing I've heard, maybe they were afraid. Hey, if we hang around here, same thing may happen to us.
That's the way that Dr. King tended to look at this story. The first 2 guys pass by because they see the man in the ditch. And they don't ask, if I do not help, what will happen to him? They ask, if I do help, what will happen to me? We do that, right? There's nothing they do in this story that we have not done in different moments. Yeah?
I just think it's interesting that the temple assistant actually walked over, took a look, and then this is going to be too involved.
They chose not to.
I think that they were more concerned with being late or getting to the synagogue.
Well, so, I mean, yes and no. The temple service runs constantly, essentially. There's no real late. Worship in the temple, sacrifices in the temple, that was an ongoing process, day and night. They're going, and at this point, we actually don't get if I remember correctly, and give me a quick chance to read it, we don't know if they're headed to or from the temple. We just know they passed by. That's not an important part of the story as far as Jesus telling is concerned. We've made it a much more important part than it has. Simple enough. They saw somebody in need and chose not to help. They decided that man was not their neighbor. That's what the story wants to get across. Here are people that should help that decide not to. In a storytelling about who my neighbor is and isn't, they made a decision that the person in the ditch was not their neighbor. The story keeps going. Then a despised Samaritan came along.
Interesting.
This is not how the story is supposed to be told. If you read Jewish literature from the time, if you read rabbinic teaching, there are three categories of Jewish people that you talk about. It's the priests, the Levites, and everybody else, the Jews. So when Jesus tells a story, and the first one is a priest, and the next one is a Levite, who's supposed to be the third one? Problem number one is that Jesus puts the Samaritans where the Jews are supposed to be. They're already going to be upset by the intrusion of a Samaritan into their place. The story takes its first turn there. So Jesus is making an equation there that the people who are in the crowd are not going to like. Remember, 2 of his own followers tried to nuke these people just a chapter ago. Can we just burn the village down to the ground, give them the Sodom and Gomorrah treatment, fire from heaven, roast them all? And Jesus says, priest, Levite, Samaritan. Problem number 1 in the story. Problem 2, when he saw the man, he felt compassion for them. Samaritans don't feel compassion. They hate us. They're terrible people. They want us dead. We want them dead. They've tried to kill us. We've tried to kill them. There's no room for a Samaritan in our world, and certainly not to be the good guy. And yet here in this story, as Jesus talks to this temple teacher of the law, you have a Samaritan who's the good guy, who feels compassion and does something about it. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I am here." And then Jesus looks at the person with whom he's having this conversation and asks the loaded question. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor? Took on the actions of a neighbor to the man in the ditch? The man replied, "The Samaritan." No, he didn't. Which has always been one of those little humorous points that preachers use to make at the end, but we've overlooked just how serious this relationship is. This is not a mutual dislike. Hatred does not cover the level of animosity that exists between these 2 tribes. So maybe a better way of describing it is to think about a place in the world where tribal warfare is ongoing and historic, and everybody has committed atrocities on both sides. This is true of a number currently of African nations where there are insurgent forces fighting against government forces. They swap leads every few years and then take it back. And this is true between the Kurdish people in regions of Iraq, Iran, and Syria, where there's ongoing guerrilla warfare between the Kurds and whichever government force in those nations exists, and has been for hundreds of years.
Ireland.
This is that on a scale that is difficult for us to understand, because for the most part, we live in an insular and isolated world. Right? We don't get good comparisons here. Because I don't have anybody really in my life who, if they helped me or I helped them, I'd think, oh no. But for these people, for this time in history and for their experience, absolutely. Of course the man can't bring himself to say the Samaritan was good. He can't bring himself to say Samaritan. He can't bring himself to imagine a world in which this could be the case. Yeah.
Like I was mentioning in these films that I've seen here recently, this meeting the unexpected, meeting the unseen. And he says, unless you will never see the unseen until you can see Christ. Once you've seen Christ, you have to see Christ first before you can really see the worth and the value of the unseen.
Yeah.
And that's what he's saying, that they couldn't see the value in them. And they're trying to show that the neighbor, there's a value in everybody.
Yes.
The question that Jesus asked them now.
Yeah.
Who do you say was a neighbor to this man in need? And that's important. He's turned the whole thing around. It's not who is my neighbor, but who are you a neighbor to?
Yes, it's about action. Y'all caught that I started the telling of this parable by pointing out that when Jesus tells a parable, it's to move people to do something. Mm-hmm. This is where that shows up. Who is my neighbor? Who is being a neighbor?
Right. And
what does it
likewise?
What does it mean to be a neighbor? The interesting way to understand this, because you can make application even if we don't have. I messed up and my wife's walking out of my class here.
I can't blame her.
The singers are leaving. So there's a way to understand this that should indict us, because what you just did is run down a list of people, right, that we tend to hold at arm's length. That's one of those markers to me of a lack of self-awareness on our own end, where we don't see our own struggles and sins and shortcomings, because other people are the ones who are wrong, not me. The guy in this story, the one who challenges Jesus, is a guy who is right. He is the church-going dude. He's been teacher of the law. He's the congregational preacher or whatever, however you want to designate him. He's a guy who's on the inside. And we look at people as to whether they're in or out. But Jesus tells a story where even the worst possible cultural enemy is in. And it's our actions that decide whether or not we are doing as we should or not. This is one of those interesting things to develop that I talked a little bit about last Sunday, and will continue to do so through the series on discipleship. We've made a giant mistake by deciding belonging or faithfulness is about believing the right set of doctrines. Because when Jesus has an opportunity to talk about final judgment, separation of the sheep and the goats, what they don't get is a question on orthodoxy. You believed the right things. Do they? I was sick and you helped me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. It wasn't, I was in an argument with the church down the street and I was correct about the right interpretation of this Greek word, which we've done historically, right? That's our background. Jesus' question to the teacher of the law in front of him was not, how do you interpret the law with words? When he gets that answer, Jesus says, okay, let's talk about what that looks like in practice. Who is your neighbor? And then tells a story where the good guy is the one who everyone else would have stared at as the worst of the worst. And I can say from loads of experience that at moments of need along the way, it has very often been non-church people that were helpful when church people were less than helpful. This whole concept that you have to be of the right set of beliefs and ideas in order to be a good person, and everybody else is somehow terrible. Jesus has an audience in front of him that fits that description every bit as much as we often do. And he says, okay, that Samaritan that you have no desire to ever let into your house, into your synagogue, into your space. Yeah, that guy. Steve.
Carrying that further, when you go in context, look at the ending there. The next story about Mary and Martha. You were talking about hospitality,
yes.
Okay? How do we show hospitality to Jesus?
Yeah.
And Jesus shows clearly, you don't do it just by being busy and serving him. You sit at his feet and you hear him like Mary did.
Well, and the go and do likewise is the hinge point of this passage. Yeah, Steve.
Very good example of this and me is when I lived in Redmond. There was a guy who moved in across the street who I looked down on. And there was another guy who lived just further down the street who I was thinking was doing almost the same thing, but I thought, well, he's okay. Then my neighbor next door to me gets cancer. Now, I'm a deacon at the time and a good Christian guy who's doing all kinds of stuff.
For those of you on video, you missed the scare quotes that he threw up whenever he...
And that person I was very connected to, my neighbor. She gets cancer. What do? Nothing. What does the guy who I despise do? Drives her to the hospital and takes her to all of her doctor's appointments because her husband was trying to run a business and couldn't do it. The person I despised and was looking down on is that I'm better than him. He was showing a Christian example, and I was not.
So, again, the key here is go and do likewise, which is often what we don't want to do. Much like the person who's on the receiving end of this story, we like the comfort that the strong lines that we've drawn as individuals that keep us separated from or allow us to despise and detest other people, however we try to categorize. Jesus tends to destroy the categorizing here. He uses it to his advantage to remind the guy that's in front of him that neighbor, as defined by God, has no limits. And that what he is to do, therefore we are to do, is to mimic the Samaritan in this story. To look not to personal boundaries, historic animosities, things that we have decided, sometimes quite inaccurately, are right or wrong. To see the humanity of the people who are around us and to see the neighbor that exists in all of them. I think what holds the church back from actually being the church is a refusal to see the image of God in everybody. We see it in the people who are like us that make us comfortable. And we start coming up with reasons not to see it in other people, which is a giant swing and miss on our end. We've got to let go of that other people language, that other people idea, and do a better job of seeing neighbor, image of God, beloved. I think once we do that, we might actually get somewhere. But right now, we're more comfortable seeing all the things we see wrong with other people based on what they've done in the past or how they vote or which party sign is in front of their house or all of the other things that, y'all did this week. And we got to let go of that. The church can't allow itself to be limited by the cultural boundaries that we've adopted. It's a terrible adoption on our part. We've got to do better. All right, I've got to hit the end button because we're already over. And I see hands, so.
Well, when we talk about the Good Samaritan, I always think of the lady at the well.
Yeah.
And in that case, they wanted Jesus to stay.
Yes.
They wanted him to physically stay there. And then when he was going to Jerusalem, I just assumed that they went to make plans for him to spend the night at that village. And that was like a hot poker up the wall.
We don't know it's the same village. There are all sorts of villages in Samaria. It's a relatively large region at the time. We can talk more about that at a different point. But yeah, we're wrapping it up for today. It's an interesting interaction all the way.